was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord."
I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord."
I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord."
Standing on the holy ground,
Bound firmly together,
We give thanks to the name of the Lord. And
together we pray for peace. Peace within these walls.
peace within our family and friends.
Peace within ourselves.
In the house of God, we give thanks to the name of the Lord.
The scripture for today is Isaiah 2, 1-5. The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples, that they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord."
In the summer of 2009, we moved from Bern, Indiana to Pandora, Ohio. As with all moves, there were many new things to learn during the months as we settled into our home, into our new church community, and into the small town of Pandora. That fall, when Julia, our youngest, headed off to college in Virginia, I was trying to figure out where and how I fit into this new place. It was during this time that one of the women from our congregation invited me to join her and a couple of other women in their routine of walking. Several times a week, we met simply to walk together for 30 to 45 minutes. It was usually kind of a vigorous pace, so we walked as a form of exercise. But more importantly, our walking together provided time for conversation. We talked about mundane, ordinary things. We talked about people that were important to us, like our children and our husbands and our siblings and our friends. We talked about what was happening in our community. We talked about what was happening in our world. In our walking and talking, we entered into each other's lives. As we shared, we learned to know what was really important to us, what was truly close to our hearts. During Advent, during Advent, we are all being invited, like Derek has already said, to join in walking together to discover what is truly close to God's heart. We are invited on these 4 weeks' journey to walk in the way of God's heart, to hear again the familiar scriptures and to see with new eyes the coming of God's Son, Jesus, into the world. And in this person, Jesus, to see the embodiment of God's heart, opening ourselves to discovering and learning more of what God's visions for God's kingdom here on earth is to be, and the implications for our daily walk. In this morning's text from the first part of Isaiah 2, the prophet Isaiah paints a beautiful picture of the future. In the days to come, a vision of what God desires, a vision of what's in God's heart, a vision where all nations and people will stream to God's mountain to be taught the ways of God and be invited to walk in God's path. A vision where justice and peace will prevail, not injustice and war. A vision familiar to us as Mennonites, the image of beating swords into plowshares and pruning spears into pruning hooks. A vision where there will no longer be wars between nations. All people will be invited to come and walk in the light of the Lord. All will be invited to learn to walk in the way of God's heart. Isaiah was able to provide this wonderful vision despite the reality of what he saw around him. At the time of Isaiah, the political situation was tense. The house of Judah, that southern part of the divided kingdom, was in a difficult place politically. The northern kingdom of Israel and the Armenian kingdom of Damascus was trying to force Judah into an unwise alliance in opposition to the large Assyrian empire who was threatening to invade. So tension and conflict, potential for war, was a reality. It was not only a difficult time between nations, but the people of Judah, the people of God, were abandoning the covenant they had made with God. They were turning from walking with God. If we had read the rest of Isaiah 2, we would have noticed that it does not paint a pretty picture like the first 5 verses. The prophet condemns the waywardness and idolatry of the people. He describes them as forsaking the ways of God, which they had been taught. Instead, they were following diviners from the east and soothsayers like the Philistines, who were pagan fortune tellers. That this was not what God had asked the people to do. Isaiah goes on to describe their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. This land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. The people of God had become rich and wealthy. They had gained these riches by exploiting the poor in contradiction to the covenant of God. Theologian and historian Walter Brueggemann notes that the results of the people amassing wealth required weapons to protect it. The more riches they accumulated, the more chariots, horses, and weapons they need to protect themselves. Instead of trusting in the Lord, they held an ideology of self-sufficiency with their wealth and their weapons. Their human pride refused to trust in God's power to save. And then on top of all this, Isaiah describes the land filled with idols, where people were bowed down to the work of their own hands. So even in worship, the people were not walking in the way of God. The reality of Isaiah's world gave him no indication that he could hope for a vision of peace and justice that he proclaimed. And unfortunately, the condition of our world today is equally distressing. Wars, conflicts, divisions are a way of life. There are wars and conflicts within nations and between nations. We hear regularly news of conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, but also in places like Nigeria and Sudan. Historical sites and artifacts are being destroyed, innocent lives are being lost, and people are fleeing for their safety. From time to time, we see a glimmer of hope when there's peace treaties, but even that, there hasn't often failed to bring lasting peace. And the conflict between Israel and Palestine continues year after year, and even more so in recent years with the building of the wall. Solutions offered in these situations mostly by the Sea of Galilee, military power and strategies. No hint of not training for war anymore or finding alternative ways of solving these conflicts. Here in our own country, particularly, we have noticed during this election season, this has been a time of division and tension and conflict. The differences between us have been accentuated. It has been a time of solidifying those things that separate us rather than looking for ways to walk together. Over the past several years, too, it also seems it's been a time of fear. People are feeling unsafe and vulnerable and are looking for ways to secure their wealth and way of life. Americans are asking our government to keep us secure with strong military might and by keeping out anyone who could possibly harm us. We have fear of the other, the person or ideology or platform that is not ours, and it leads to separation and division rather than people working and walking together. In response to such a world as this, Isaiah's vision offers us a promise of something different. Isaiah's vision transcended the reality around him, and it also transcends the reality around us. No matter what our present circumstances are, the day is coming when God's reign will be established, when God's peace will reign rather than war. Isaiah's vision begins by declaring that in God's future, the mountain of the Lord's house will become the highest ground above everything else. From this hill of visible vantage place, God will call all nations and all people together. All the nations will stream to it. All people, even Gentiles, will walk together up the mountain. A welcome by God to all people, not an exclusive place for any particular people. A new community will come together. A community that encompasses all cultures and all races and all languages. In the text, as the people come nearer, they urge each other on and call out each other the longing that draws them to this common center. Verse 3 says, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths." There on the mountain of God, this diverse group of people will encounter and meet God, who will teach them God's ways. They will meet God, who speaks not only in words but in acts. They will hear not only with their ears but with their hearts. The people will learn the way of God's heart. They will walk together in God's way, carrying with them God's heart. This instruction by God, it turns out, includes arbitration. God shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many people. God, in other words, will not only speak, but he will listen. He will listen to the grievances, the disputes, and the concerns of the nations, and he will resolve issues and offer justice. The nations and people are about to make peace, but God first gives the gift of justice. Inequities will be balanced, shackles will be loosened, things will be set right, so that the reasons for envy, greed, resentment, retribution, and fear will be abolished, so we will no longer need weapons. So out of justice will come transformation. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Resources once needed for battle and war can now be transformed into tools for farming and gardening. These tools that the community can use to provide health and life and nourishment. Nations will trade in their swords, and war will not be the focus any longer. This transformational image has stirred the imagination of many generations. It is the inspiration for the large sculpture that stands outside the General Assembly Tower at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. Also, Mennonite artist Esther Augsburger created a large sculpture based on this text as well that was displayed for many years in Washington, D.C., where she collected actual guns turned into the police to help reduce violence in the city, and she welded them onto a large plow. This image shows the hope for a world transformed to reflect God's heart for a world of peace and harmony, a world where we can walk in the way of peace. After this powerful image, Isaiah ends with an invitation. Come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Come, join together with God in this vision of peace. In Advent, we lift our sight beyond the challenges and crises of our time to see that God is already acting to bring this vision into reality in our world. God's heart is one of love, which comes into the world as Jesus, the Christ child, who brings the light into our world. Jesus is the love of God incarnate. Jesus shows us God's heart. The darkness of the world will not prevail. Conflict will be replaced by community. The reign of God is already coming. The light of the world is coming in Jesus, bringing salvation for all the nations. The birth of this Christ child will be proclaimed with the words, "Peace on earth, goodwill to all people." Atop a hill in the area of Palestine, southwest of Bethlehem, lives a faith community on the farmland of the Nasser family. Lisa Harper, a writer for Sojourner magazine, shared her story of her visit to this community. She was a part of a group that traveled by bus, which wound its way around sharp corners up a hill until it came to a stop. Their guide, Amal Nassar, explained that they could not continue further in the bus because the Israeli government had set large boulders in the middle of the road to block traffic from reaching her family's farm, so the group had to hike the rest of the way. They stepped off the bus and started walking up the dirt road strewn with rocks and trash. The government had declared this property for the state of Israel and had ceased to provide basic services such as trash pickup, electricity, and running water to the Palestinians in the area. Amal explained that many families had just simply chosen to leave because it was too difficult. But her family stayed because the farm that they had legally owned in their family for over 100 years was there. The land was claimed by the Israeli government in 1991 and has been tied up in court proceedings ever since. But the family has decided that they have transformed this family farm into what is called the Tent of Nations, a place of multi-ethnic and interfaith dialogue, works, and learning, a place to encounter diverse people to discover the way of God's heart. The Tent of Nations is also a place of creative, nonviolent resistance to unjust state encroachment on Palestinian land. As the tour group walked closer to the farm entrance, they began to see rocks with messages painted on them. The first one read, "We refuse to be enemies," a sign of peace. At the top of the hill sits the house. The house is a humble dwelling, simple and rustic, where the people gather. A black water storage container crowns the roof. A cable floats from the roof of the house to the roof of another building that holds massive solar panels. The Tent of Nations is resisting removal by living 100% off the grid. So when the government shut off electricity, the family installed solar power. When the government shut off running water, the family installed compost toilets. Using plastic bags picked up from the roads of their farm, women weave baskets and sell them. From the house, the group also were guided into a cave where the family has lived for generations. Now this cave has been transformed into a place of dialogue toward common understanding. So this family has chosen to deal with the systematic oppression they face, not with violence and not by running away, but instead have chosen to act differently because of their belief in the Son of Justice, to refuse to fight and refuse to hate and to live the good news of the gospel of Jesus, the gospel of peace. They are choosing to welcome people of different races and faiths to this hilltop to learn and work together for understanding and to promote peace and nonviolence. They are living God's vision of peace in this place, choosing to follow the heart of God in the midst of difficulty, walking in the way of peace. God is at work. God's reign is coming, and the invitation is ours. Come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Come, let us walk in the way of God's heart. Come, let us walk in the way of peace. Amen.